So Mo has told me just to jump up here and start straight in, so I will. I'm going to cover 5 areas quite briefly, quite skating across the top. I thought I'd tell you in advance what I'm going to do, and then if you're having one of those post-lunch moments, when your eyes start and mind start functioning again, you'll kind of roughly know where you are. The first one I'm going to look at, I'm going to talk a little bit about conflict trends, where conflict trends and dynamics stand in the world today. I'm then going to look a little bit at the drivers of conflict risk. I'm then going to look at, under sort of 2 components, the third and the fourth parts of my talk, at political responses. First, at political responses which I think are increasing the risks, and secondly, at political responses which I think might help to mitigate those risks. And then fifthly, I'm going to talk almost in practical terms, but this is a university, so I'm not going to get really practical about stuff, about what can be done. And I thought that I might tell you in advance one of the sort of themes, one of the framework of my thinking as I approach these kinds of problems, these kinds of issues. And it's actually right here. It's up here in the title. It's not the bit that makes you gloomy. I mean, what a happy place Lund is, you know, disasters evermore. Come and have a fun afternoon with disaster and conflict people. It's after the question mark. It's when you come onto an uncertain world. If you took away the un, would that make it worse or better? Would past, present, and future risk in a certain world actually be a safer place? What I'm going to suggest is that one of the things that we have to learn how to do at a very broad level, this is as individuals, as institutions, as a human community, is to understand that uncertainty is also good. Uncertainty means there are possibilities. Uncertainty means it's not yet settled. You know, when Arsenal are 3-0 down with 30 seconds to go, it's still uncertain. Every weekend. No, all right, I won't go there. It's fine, don't worry. So, first the conflict trends. A little bit of good news and bad news. The big untold good news story for 20 years after the end of the Cold War was that the world was becoming identifiably, provably, empirically, a more peaceful place. The expansion of the zone of peace internationally was quite dramatic. From 1994 until 2007, the number of armed conflicts declined each year. In 1950, before a little spike at the beginning of the 90s, 1990, before a little spike at the beginning of the 90s, just at the exact year, really, when the Cold War ended, there were 50 armed conflicts. In 2010, 20 years later, there were 30. Right? That was progress. That was an advance that we failed to register in many ways, perhaps for human reasons. We thought about Darfur. We thought about Iraq. We thought about the war on terror, one of the most ill-conceived human adventures of all time, which has only managed to bring us more war and more terror at the same time. But despite all of that, despite the worst efforts of all of those people who were behind those horrible events, actually the world was becoming safer. More peace agreements were being made than ever before, and a higher proportion of them were being fully implemented over a longer period than ever before. In 2010, unfortunately, it started to turn. The good news first, the bad news comes second. By 2015, the number of armed conflicts is back up to 50 again. So in a sense, you could say that the progress of the 90s and the noughts has been lost in the last half-decade. The focus of armed conflict has, in some senses, moved. It's less now about sub-Saharan Africa and more about the Middle East than it was. And so that moment of hope, 2011, the so-called Arab Spring, as we came to call it, has actually turned out not to be so much a spring as the onset of probably 1 to 2 decades of intense instability, conflict, suffering, and misery. Only in Tunisia do the flowers still bloom, and there it's not really certain that democracy will persist. But it's uncertain, and so that's better than it being certain that it won't persist. Warfare seemed to have left Europe after the Balkan period in the 1990s. As we've seen, it's come back. There is a new form of East-West rivalry and East-West contestation, which we don't know quite where it will go. But in some ways, in terms of, if one's thinking East-West and thinking of larger conflicts between great powers, or between major regional powers, the focus of concern has shifted from Europe to East Asia. Obviously, Northeast Asia, the events of the last week or so, the assassination of the North Korean leader's brother, the new missile test of potentially a very long-range missile, stated to be a practice run for an attack on American bases in Japan, just to keep things nicely stoked up. The rivalry between China and many of the other regional players in the South China Sea, and now also the beginnings of a confrontation between China and Japan in the East China Sea. So the focus of concern in some ways has shifted. It's kind of not quite the same, but similar in a very different location. And just to round this off, a quick thought about nuclear weapons. There are now about 15,000 nuclear warheads in the world. It's a horribly high number. It's less than a quarter of what there was at the peak of the Cold War. So the bad news number is actually a good news number. That number is actually declining. Though US-Russian relations had been deteriorating in the last couple of years, and I say had been because we don't really know where they're going to go in the next year or so, though those relations had been deteriorating, the agreement, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty that had been made between the USA and Russia in 2010, started implementing in 2011, that is being respected. It's being enacted. So the number of nuclear weapons is actually coming down. So that's good news, except for the fact that all nuclear weapon states, and there are now 9 of them, and counting North Korea as one, all nuclear weapon states are currently modernizing their arsenals in one sense or another. The US and Russia obviously have the most ambitious, large programs, but Britain and France are moving on to the next generations with their nuclear weapons. China is actually expanding its nuclear arsenal at the moment. Pakistan, India, and North Korea also seem to be developing their nuclear weapons further. So from a conflict and security point of view, if you feel the world is a more dangerous place now than it was in the middle of the Cold War, I would say that's really arguable. I don't actually know how to measure it, but there is no evidence to say that it is really disastrously worse now than in the mid-1980s or the mid-1960s or so. If you think that it's worse than it was 5 years ago, or 7, 8 years ago, I think you're approximately right. Big power interstate relations are worse. Armed conflicts are on the increase. Now, what's driving this? Moving on to the second area I said I was going to talk about. I'm going to go quickly through a number of what I see as being the major drivers of risk in the contemporary world. The first one actually is what Margareta was mentioning almost like it was the villain of the piece, but it's climate change. Right? And along with climate change, but climate change as the most dramatic example of the environmental shifts which are happening and the way that those affect the human habitat. It is not a direct A to B causal relationship. When I hear people arguing about whether or not climate change causes war, I have 2 reactions. One is, you are having the wrong discussion, and the other one is you do not have the evidence for this wrong discussion which you're trying to have. The effects are indirect. The effects are on how people live, on their institutions, on how they handle relations between themselves, between each other. And it plays into another area of risk, a second conflict risk driver: inequalities. Inequality is increasing worldwide. All available studies show it, whether it's Thomas Piketty or whether it's the studies of inequality in Europe, whether it's IMF studies. Worldwide, inequalities are increasing. And again, the issue is not inequality causes war, but what inequality does do is it creates a large pool of people with grievances and resentment who make a pool for recruitment, if you like, into armed conflicts as those conflicts begin for whatever reason. Most conflicts are begun for very, very narrow reasons and are begun by what you could call conflict entrepreneurs who need to invest in the conflict and gain and mobilize support for that. And where will a lot of that support come from? It's from those who are on the receiving end of inequality. The third issue is to do with resources. I haven't got time to go through the figures to try to demonstrate this. But we live not only in a world where the population is increasing, but where the urban population is increasing. Right? It's only 200 years ago that the world population passed the 1 billion mark for the first time. And at that point, 2% of the world population are believed to have lived in cities. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was 10%. Today, it is 50%, and in 20 years' time, it's projected to be 70%. And if you work out the statistics of that, what is needed in order to accommodate that increasing urban population is the equivalent of constructing a new city of 3 million people every week for 20 years. Half the urban infrastructure we will be living in 20 years' time has not yet been built. And that means using up a lot of water, a lot of sand, a lot of metals, of needing raw materials, and of problems about the increasing shortages of both the raw materials that sustain life and the raw materials which are economically and strategically important. And again, that puts pressure on populations, on institutions, on governments. It increases conflicts and makes it harder to handle them. The fourth factor is to do with the changing balance in world power. We see that quite clearly now. Russia is more assertive, China is more powerful, the US is whatever the US is at the moment. We can take that up in questions afterwards. I always like it when you have a good Q&A session because you can park anything complex for later reference. The EU is also whatever the EU is, not an actor, a unified actor in world politics or in world affairs. And this makes it, these changes and others that you're probably aware of because you read the news and you're interested people about the roles of Brazil, India, Indonesia, Turkey, and so on, Nigeria, South Africa. These problems, these changes, they're not necessarily all bad, but they make it more difficult to run the international institutions which have been an important part of handling conflict problems over the past 20 to 25 years. And difficulties in making those institutions work effectively are part of the problem that we see today. And the last thing which I want to say about this conflict risks is that we live in a system that is incredibly fragile. It's fragile environmentally, it's fragile in terms of the climate, it's fragile economically, as we saw from the 2008-2009 economic crash. It's fragile financially. How much money is there in the world today? $60 trillion. How much cash is there in the world today? $6 trillion. Figure's easy to remember. A leverage ratio of 10 to 1. It would be like I lend you £100 and you get £100 in your account. I have £100 in my account and I lend you £100. Then you, then you, then you. And over here I'll do it in euros. 100 euros, 100 euros, 100 euros. Then you, in krona this time, but 1,000, 1,000, 1,000. Right? I just keep on lending you the money. I don't have the money. It's just a paper transfer. But with that mythical money, you buy, you invest, you get wealthy in a kind of way, you have a car, you live a good life. There's just a feeling about that it could just explode. Now, what's the response to this? Well, I think that the negative response, the first one which I want to comment on, is to batter down the uncertainties, to make America great again, to refer back to a past, to be the Britain we used to be before we got involved with all those Europeans, to be a country that's pure in some kind of way, no uncertainties. It leads to, I think, as we see, different political forms it takes: Putin, Trump, Brexit, Marine Le Pen, Wilders in the Netherlands. It leads to Viktor Orban in Hungary. I don't know if you've seen today, but every asylum seeker in Hungary will be imprisoned in containers, in shipping containers, for heaven's sakes. Every single asylum seeker. That's the law that has just been passed. And this leads, as Mo was indicating at the beginning, to less cooperation, less law, less multilateralism, less trust, less commitment, less energy in international institutions, just at a time when we need more. So what would the counter-trend be? What's the politics that moves in the other direction? Some of it is to do with policies and actions, but some of it is to do with the tone. Being prepared to be reflective, to think past the first 10 words, as it was said in West Wing. Part of it is to do with evidence, to be ready to be based on evidence. And part of it is to do with a cast of mind, which I kind of think of as being the skepticism of the open-hearted. Right? Be skeptical, ask questions, but do so not with a closed heart, but with an open heart. And I think that we're losing some of the texture of political discourse. There's so much anger and there's so much simplicity of statement. And we need a little bit more trust in both in kindness and in complexity. So 3 things that could then be done. One is, which the Swedish government is doing, and I'm so pleased to be offering advice from time to time when asked about this, but I'm so proud to see Sweden doing this on the UN Security Council, is to be taking climate change into the Security Council. It is an issue that threatens human security worldwide. It should be being discussed there. The second thing is to address inequalities. Inequality is a social issue, it's a security issue, it's a human issue. And the third thing is to revive something quite old-fashioned. But when I was going to an institution like this, it was what we talked about all the time, and I think we ought to see a little bit more of it in the world today. Solidarity. Solidarity with people whom we don't know and causes which are theirs, but not necessarily to begin with ours. Thank you very much.